He never let anyone close, until a little girl pulled out the toy that revealed a secret which would change everything. Liam was only 4 years old, but his world already felt unbearably heavy. He lived in a mansion filled with glittering chandeliers, marble floors that echoed with every step, and shelves overflowing with toys that most children could only dream about. Yet none of it mattered to him. His small figure often retreated into the corner of his large playroom, where he would sit in silence, clutching his knees or staring at the wall as if the brightness of his surroundings was too much for his tired little heart. Since the day his mother had died, something inside him had shattered. It was not the kind of pain a hug or a gift could heal. It was the kind of loss that left him hollow, distrustful, and afraid of letting anyone close enough to hurt him again. His father, Richard, was a man who commanded entire rooms with his presence. People in suits bowed their heads when he walked by, business partners hung on every word he said, and reporters wrote about his empire with a mixture of admiration and envy. But when it came to his son, Richard felt helpless. He had hired the best nannies, therapists, and tutors. He brought home new toys every week, toys that sparkled, talked, and lit up with music, but Liam barely glanced at them. The boy would push them away, leaving them in piles untouched. No matter how hard Richard tried, Liam kept everyone at a distance, including him. Richard longed to scoop his son into his arms and tell him that everything would be okay, but every time he approached, Liam's blue eyes would grow cold, and his tiny body would stiffen as if even his father had become a stranger. The house staff whispered about how strange it was to see such a small child walking alone through the grand hallways, his shoes tapping softly on marble, his head bowed. Sometimes he wandered into the garden and sat by the fountain, dipping his fingers into the water just to watch the ripples. Other times he locked himself in his room, surrounding himself with silence that no one dared to break. At night, the shadows seemed to frighten him, and he cried quietly into his pillow, but when anyone came in, he would quickly wipe his face and turn away. He wanted no pity, no comfort. The only thing he seemed to want was to be left alone. There were moments when Richard thought he caught a glimpse of the boy his son used to be before tragedy struck. Once, he saw Liam pause in the hallway to look at a photograph of his mother, her warm smile frozen in time, and the boy's small fingers brushed the frame with such tenderness that Richard's throat tightened. But as soon as he stepped closer, Liam's expression closed off again, and he turned away, shutting that fragile part of himself behind invisible walls. Richard's grief was different, but just as consuming. Losing his wife had nearly destroyed him, and yet he had buried himself in work, thinking he could drown the pain in endless meetings, contracts, and acquisitions. He told himself he was doing it for Liam, that he was building a future for his son, but deep down he knew he was also running from the emptiness that filled the house at night. And now, watching his little boy wither behind his walls of silence, Richard realized he had lost more than his wife. He was losing his son too. But Liam was too young to understand the weight of all this. What he knew was simple. The world had taken away the one person who loved him most, and he no longer trusted it to give him anything good again. So he built his own defenses, refusing to let anyone in. Not the nannies who tried to coax him with gentle voices, not the tutors who offered praise, not even his father who carried the same eyes as him but seemed like a distant figure. For Liam, loneliness was safer than the risk of opening his heart. And so, in a mansion filled with light, laughter, and movement, a little boy sat in the shadows, clutching his knees, wishing for something he could not name. He had no idea that soon, a single encounter would begin to change everything, that someone unexpected would find a way past the walls he had built, holding in her hands not wealth or promises, but a simple toy that carried the key to a truth none of them yet understood. Emma was 6 years old, but her small shoulders carried burdens that seemed far too heavy for a child her age. Her world was not lined with marble floors or guarded by iron gates. It was a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper, creaking floorboards, and windows that let in drafts no matter how tightly her grandmother tried to shut them. The smell of old books and laundry soap lingered in the air, and every corner of the place told the story of survival, not comfort. Emma had learned early that life did not offer her luxuries, only lessons. She knew what it meant to count coins carefully before buying bread, what it meant to wear the same shoes even after they had grown too tight, and what it meant to fall asleep listening to her grandmother's sighs of exhaustion rather than bedtime stories. Her mother had been the heart of her world. Emma still remembered her soft voice, her warm hands, and the way she smelled faintly of lavender even when she was sick. The memory of those days was blurred now, but one thing remained sharp: the moment her mother had handed her a small white plush rabbit and whispered that it would keep her safe. The rabbit was worn and slightly faded, but to Emma it was a treasure more precious than anything else she owned. She clutched it tightly every night, pressing its soft ears against her cheek as if she could still feel her mother's presence through it. Her grandmother often reminded her that the toy was special, that it had belonged to her mother long before Emma was born, but neither of them knew the true significance that lay hidden in its seams. Emma's grandmother, a woman who had aged too quickly from grief and responsibility, did her best to care for the child. She worked long hours at a bakery, her hands rough from kneading dough, her back bent from lifting heavy trays. Yet no matter how tired she was, she always tried to bring Emma a small treat, a cookie or a piece of fruit, as if to prove that there was still sweetness in the world. Still, the girl could see the shadows in her grandmother's eyes, the kind that come from secrets kept too long. Whenever Emma asked about her father, the woman would quickly change the subject or shake her head, saying only that it was complicated. Emma eventually stopped asking, but inside she carried a quiet longing. She would sometimes imagine what he looked like, whether he would have smiled at her, whether he would have lifted her into his arms the way other fathers did with their children at the park. But those thoughts always ended with a tight ache in her chest, so she kept them hidden, just like the tears she wiped away before bed. Despite the weight of her reality, Emma had a resilience that shone in small ways. She loved to draw with stubby crayons on scraps of paper, sketching houses with gardens and families who held hands. She hummed to herself when she helped her grandmother fold clothes, pretending the sound was a lullaby her mother once sang. And she never went anywhere without her rabbit. Its button eyes were scratched, its seams were loosening, but she treated it as though it were alive, talking to it in whispers when no one else was around. She believed it listened, and in those moments of quiet conversation, she did not feel quite as alone. One morning her grandmother told her they were going somewhere different, a place where children gathered for special activities. It was part of a charity program, she explained, something that would give Emma a chance to play, to learn, to be around other kids. Emma was hesitant at first, clutching her rabbit tighter, unsure of how she would fit in among strangers. But her grandmother insisted, smoothing her golden hair and helping her into her sweater, telling her that she needed to see the world outside their apartment. So Emma agreed, though her heart pounded with nerves as they walked through the city toward the hotel where the event was being held. When they arrived, Emma was overwhelmed by the brightness of it all. The walls gleamed, the floors shone, and the other children were dressed in clothes much nicer than hers. She felt the familiar sting of difference, of not belonging, but she straightened her small shoulders and held her rabbit like a shield. She reminded herself of her mother's words, that the toy would always protect her. With that thought, she gathered her courage and stepped inside. She did not yet know that in this place, her life would change forever. She did not know that her rabbit, the one object she thought was simply her last memory of her mother, was a thread connecting her to a truth buried deep in the past. She did not know that her path would cross with a boy who looked at the world with the same sadness she carried in her heart. And she did not know that through pain, secrets, and shocking revelations, she would find not only answers but also the family she had been missing all along. The Children's Activity Center was bustling with energy that afternoon, filled with laughter, chatter, and the sounds of toys being shared across tables. Bright banners hung from the ceiling, colorful mats were spread on the floor, and volunteers in cheerful shirts moved between groups of kids, encouraging them to join in the games. To most children, it was a place of excitement and fun, but to Liam it felt suffocating. He sat alone in the corner, his small hands curled around a rubber ball, his blue eyes scanning the room with suspicion. Every attempt from another child to approach him was met with silence or a sharp turn of his head, as if the very act of being noticed was unbearable. He was not cruel, simply guarded, and the wall he had built around himself was thicker than anything the volunteers could break through. Emma entered the room clutching her rabbit tightly against her chest, her grandmother giving her a gentle squeeze on the shoulder before stepping back to let her explore. The girl stood still for a moment, her wide blue eyes watching the groups of children run past her. She felt out of place, her clothes simpler, her hair slightly messy from the walk. She lowered her gaze, biting her lip, until she noticed a boy sitting apart from everyone else. Something about his loneliness mirrored her own. Slowly, she walked toward him, her rabbit's soft ears brushing against her arm as if encouraging her to be brave. Liam noticed her before she spoke, and his shoulders tensed. He expected another child to laugh at him, to ask why he was alone, or to tug the ball from his hands. Instead, the girl simply sat down beside him, close enough to be noticed but far enough to give him space. She placed her rabbit gently on her lap and stroked its head absent-mindedly, as though she were comforting herself. The boy's gaze dropped to the toy, and his breath caught in his throat. The sight of it pierced through the fog of his sadness like a beam of light in darkness. "That rabbit," he whispered, his voice hoarse from lack of use. His words startled Emma, who hadn't expected him to speak at all. She looked at him, her eyes soft, and asked, "Do you like it?" Liam hesitated, his small fingers tightening around the ball. "Where did you get it?" His voice cracked with something deeper than curiosity, something urgent and almost desperate. Emma blinked, surprised by the question, and then answered simply. "My mom gave it to me. Before she went away. She told me to always keep it with me, that it would protect me." She hugged the rabbit closer as she spoke, as though repeating her mother's words gave her strength. The boy's face changed. His blue eyes widened, shimmering with recognition, and his lips parted as if he wanted to say more but couldn't. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the edge of the rabbit's paw, his fingertips brushing the fabric as though it carried the memory of someone he longed for. His chest tightened, his heart racing. He remembered that rabbit. Not exactly this one, but the same kind, the same soft fabric, the same gift he had seen in his mother's hands. It was the toy she had cherished, the toy she had promised meant something important. Seeing it here, in the hands of a stranger, was like seeing a ghost from his past. Emma noticed the boy's expression and tilted her head slightly. "Why are you looking at it like that?" she asked softly, her voice more curious than demanding. Liam swallowed hard, trying to find the words. "My mom, she had one just like it. She kept it with her all the time." His voice faltered, and his eyes darted to the floor as if ashamed to show the tears threatening to fall. Emma's eyes widened in surprise. She glanced at the rabbit in her lap, then back at him. "Really?" she whispered. Maybe it's the same. She told me it was special." The children around them continued playing, laughing, and shouting, oblivious to the quiet storm building between the two small figures in the corner. To anyone else, it looked like a simple exchange between kids, but in that moment something far greater was unfolding. The wall around Liam's heart had cracked, just enough to let this girl inside, because she carried with her a piece of his past, a piece of the mother he thought he had lost completely. For Emma, the boy's reaction stirred something inside her that she didn't fully understand. She had always wondered about her father, about the life her mother never told her about, and now here was a boy who seemed to share not just her sadness but something far more profound. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she felt instinctively that sitting down beside him had been the right choice. Neither of them realized that this simple encounter, the boy recognizing a toy and the girl offering a piece of her heart, was the beginning of a revelation that would turn their worlds upside down. For now, all they knew was that, for the first time in a long time, they were not entirely alone. Richard had come to the hotel reluctantly that day, agreeing to attend the charity program because one of his associates insisted it would reflect well on his company's image. He was used to being in boardrooms, not crowded activity centers filled with crayons and laughter. Still, he forced himself to make an appearance, if only because he knew his son was there. Liam's nanny had brought him earlier, and Richard wanted to see for himself whether the event was doing any good for the boy who had locked himself away since his mother's death. He told himself he was checking in out of duty, but beneath the surface was something more vulnerable, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he might catch his son smiling again. When Richard entered the room, his presence drew quick attention. Parents whispered his name, volunteers straightened their shirts, and even some of the children paused to look at the tall, broad-shouldered man in the tailored suit with piercing blue eyes. But Richard's gaze swept past all of them and went directly to the corner of the room where his son sat. He felt the familiar pang of disappointment in his chest when he saw Liam isolated as always, clutching a ball like a lifeline, avoiding every attempt at interaction. He was about to sigh and turn away when something unexpected caught his eye. A girl was sitting beside Liam. Not hovering or forcing her way into his space, but sitting gently, patiently, as though she understood the silence that surrounded him. And more astonishing than that, Liam was looking at her, not with cold suspicion but with raw intensity, his small hand trembling as he touched something in her lap. Richard frowned, his curiosity piqued. He moved closer, weaving through the crowd, until he could see what had transfixed his son. It was a rabbit. A small white plush rabbit, worn but carefully loved, it seems a little frayed, its fur dulled with age. Richard froze where he stood, his breath hitching in his throat. He knew that toy. He had seen it years ago, clutched in the hands of the woman he had loved more than anything. His wife. The very same woman whose absence had carved a hole in his heart and his son's soul. The rabbit had belonged to her. He remembered the night she told him about it, how she had kept it since childhood, how she had whispered that it carried memories she could never let go of. And now, here it was, in the hands of a girl who looked at Liam with an expression far too gentle and knowing for a child her age. Richard's pulse quickened. He forced himself to keep walking, though his mind was spinning. Who was this girl? How had she come into possession of something so intimately tied to his late wife? He stood a few feet away, unnoticed by the children, and listened. "My mom gave it to me," the girl was saying softly, her voice carrying an innocence that broke him. "She told me it would always protect me." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. He stared at her, at the rabbit, at his son's wide eyes brimming with recognition. He could barely keep himself steady as realization flickered at the edge of his thoughts. His wife had been sick for so long before she passed, but what if, no, it couldn't be. Could it? He remembered the secrets in her eyes, the things she never said, the times she disappeared with explanations that didn't add up. He had buried his suspicions, too afraid of what he might discover. And yet now, standing here, watching his son connect with a girl holding the very object that had defined his wife's past, those buried suspicions clawed their way to the surface. Emma, oblivious to Richard's turmoil, looked at Liam with quiet determination. "I think maybe we were meant to meet," she said, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. Her blonde hair caught the light from the tall windows, and her blue eyes shimmered with sincerity. Liam, still trembling, whispered back, "You remind me of her." His voice cracked, and for the first time in months, he didn't try to hide the tears that welled up. Richard had to turn away for a moment, his jaw clenched. His son's words were like knives, reminders of what they had both lost, and of the possibility that something deeper was hiding in plain sight. He rubbed his hand over his mouth, trying to collect himself, but when he looked again, he saw Liam lean closer to the girl as though he finally trusted someone. That single gesture undid him completely. The noise of the room seemed to fade as Richard struggled with the thoughts swirling in his head. Could this girl truly be connected to his wife? Could she be his daughter? The idea was too enormous, too shocking, yet the evidence was staring him in the face. He wanted to demand answers immediately, but he restrained himself. This wasn't the time or place. The children were unaware of the storm about to break over their heads. Instead, Richard stepped back, retreating into the crowd, but his eyes never left the two small figures in the corner. He watched his son's guarded heart begin to thaw, watched the girl offer him comfort in a way no one else had managed. And deep inside, he knew that this moment was not just coincidence. It was the beginning of a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his past, his marriage, and his family. As he stood there, with his pulse racing and his chest aching, Richard made a silent vow. He would find out who Emma was. He would uncover the truth his wife had taken to her grave. And no matter how painful or shocking it might be, he would face it, because the boy who had locked himself in silence had just been touched by something real, and Richard was determined not to lose it. The evening after the charity event, Richard found himself pacing his study, the glass of untouched scotch sweating on his desk. His suit jacket had been discarded over the back of a chair, his tie loosened, but no amount of physical comfort relieved the storm brewing in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of the little girl clutching the rabbit, nor the way Liam had looked at her with recognition and longing. For months his son had shut the world out, refusing comfort from tutors, relatives, or even Richard himself, but in the span of minutes, this girl had crossed the barrier no one else could breach. Richard leaned on the desk and closed his eyes, forcing himself to confront the gnawing thought he had been pushing away all day. Could it be possible that she was his daughter? It was an absurd question on the surface, one that would have made him laugh in disbelief if not for the tangible evidence staring him down. The rabbit. His late wife's most cherished possession, the one she had sworn she would never part with. She used to tell him stories of how it had traveled with her through every hardship in her youth, how she found strength in it even when no one else believed in her. After her passing, Richard had searched for the rabbit among her belongings, expecting to keep it safe for Liam as a memory of his mother. But it had been gone. He assumed it had been misplaced, perhaps lost in the hospital, and though the absence stung, he let it go. Now, years later, it had reappeared in the arms of a girl who bore the same eyes, the same quiet strength, the same unspoken pain. Richard sat heavily in the chair and rubbed his face with both hands. His wife had been a loving woman, but she was also private, carrying secrets she never fully shared. During her illness there had been weeks when she insisted she needed to be alone, trips she explained away as visits to distant relatives or treatments he didn't need to attend. He had accepted it then, too caught up in his work and too afraid of pressing her when she looked so frail. What if those absences had been something else? What if she had left behind more than he ever imagined? The thought of betrayal burned, but mingled with it was something else, guilt. He had not always been present, not always asked the questions he should have. Perhaps she had wanted to tell him, perhaps she had been searching for the right time. But time had run out, and now, in the silence of his study, Richard realized the answers lay not in the past but in the present. He needed to find out who Emma truly was. The next morning, he called in his most trusted assistant, a man named Michael who had been by his side for over a decade. Michael was discreet, loyal, and resourceful, the kind of person Richard relied on when matters required absolute secrecy. Richard handed him a slip of paper with Emma's name, which he had overheard one of the volunteers use the day before. Find everything you can about her, Richard said quietly, his voice tense but steady. Discreetly. I don't want anyone else knowing. Michael raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. He only nodded once and slipped the paper into his pocket. You'll have something within 24 hours. True to his word, by the next evening, Richard had a thin file sitting on his desk. He opened it with trembling hands and read the sparse details. Emma Carter, age 6, living with her grandmother Margaret Carter in a modest neighborhood 2 towns away. No record of her father, her mother deceased 3 years earlier from complications of illness. Richard's throat went dry as he stared at the words. A mother deceased. An absent father. A grandmother struggling to raise her. He pressed his hand to his forehead as his vision blurred. Her mother's name was written clearly in neat type. Rachel Carter. The file may as well have struck him like lightning. He remembered that name. His wife's maiden name, one she had stopped using after their marriage. The room tilted around him, and he gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. It was no coincidence. It couldn't be. His wife had left behind a daughter, and somehow, through years of silence and secrets, that daughter had found her way into the same room as his son. For a long time, Richard sat motionless, staring at the file as though it would change if he looked hard enough. Memories of his wife swirled in his mind, the soft way she had spoken, the tiredness in her eyes in her last days, the times she almost said something but swallowed the words back. He had missed it. He had missed all of it. Now he was left with a child who didn't even know he existed, a son who had unknowingly met his sister, and a heart pounding with grief, anger, and an overwhelming desire to do what was right. That night Richard made a decision. He would not let Emma grow up believing she was alone, raised only by a grandmother scraping by. He would not allow Liam to lose the only connection that had managed to draw him out of his grief. And most of all, he would not let the truth of his wife's legacy remain hidden in shadows. No matter the cost, he would bring Emma into his life and into Liam's, because she was family, and family was something he had already lost too much of. But as he closed the file and looked toward the window, where the city lights burned like distant stars, he knew the path ahead would not be easy. Emma didn't know the truth. Her grandmother might resist. And Liam, fragile as he was, might not understand the storm about to unfold. Richard exhaled slowly, bracing himself. The revelation was only the beginning. The hardest part, telling them both and rebuilding the family they never knew they had, was yet to come. Richard drove to the small neighborhood where Emma lived with her grandmother on a gray afternoon that seemed to mirror the heaviness in his chest. The streets were lined with modest houses, most in need of a coat of paint, with bicycles leaning against fences and children's toys scattered on front lawns. It was a world away from the polished glass towers he was accustomed to, yet he felt strangely humbled pulling his sleek car up to the curb. He stayed inside for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel, forcing himself to breathe slowly. He had faced hostile boardrooms, international negotiations, and the collapse of multimillion-dollar deals, but never had he felt as unsteady as he did at the thought of knocking on the door of a small house and meeting a woman who held the truth of his wife's secret. When he finally gathered the courage to step out, the cold air hit his face, sharpening his focus. He walked up the path to the front porch, noting the cracked steps and the flowerpots struggling with wilted blooms. A wind chime rattled gently in the breeze, its sound delicate and haunting. Richard raised his hand and knocked, his heart pounding hard enough to echo in his ears. After a moment, the door opened, and an older woman appeared. She had silver hair pulled back tightly, eyes the same piercing blue as Emma's, and a look that instantly sized him up. Her frame was small, but there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, as though she had carried more burdens than her body should have allowed. "Yes?" she asked, her tone cautious but not unkind. "Mrs. Carter." Richard asked, his voice more hesitant than he intended. She nodded. That's me. And you are? He swallowed, his throat dry. My name is Richard Hale. I knew your daughter. Rachel. The name hung in the air, and Margaret's eyes flickered with something sharp and guarded. She opened the door a little wider but didn't invite him in. What business do you have with Rachel? Richard shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how unprepared he was for this confrontation. I was her husband. I don't think you knew about me. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as if trying to decide whether to slam the door or let him explain. Finally, she stepped back just enough to gesture him inside. Come in. But don't expect me to pour you tea. The living room was small and cluttered but warm, filled with bookshelves, framed photographs, and the faint smell of lavender. Richard's gaze darted instinctively to a photo on the mantel, Rachel, younger and smiling, with her arms around a toddler. His breath caught. It was Emma, only smaller, her curls wild, her eyes sparkling with innocence. The sight made Richard's stomach twist with both awe and grief. He had missed those years. He hadn't even known they existed. Margaret stood with her arms crossed, her eyes never leaving his face. So. You're the one. The man Rachel never spoke of in detail. She told me enough to know she kept you away for a reason. Richard's chest tightened. I don't know what reasons she gave, but I swear to you, I never knew she had another child. She was my wife, and when she died, I believed Liam was our only child. Finding out about Emma. His voice broke, and he forced himself to steady it. It has changed everything. Margaret's face hardened, though her eyes glistened. Rachel didn't want you to know. She wanted Emma safe, away from the world you live in. She believed that life would swallow her whole. I promised her I'd raise Emma quietly, without interference, and that's exactly what I've done. And now you show up here, years later, with your wealth and your suits, thinking you can just claim her. The words struck Richard like blows, but he didn't flinch. He lowered his voice, letting the rawness in his tone show. I don't want to claim her like some possession. I want to know her. I want her to know me, to know Liam. She has a brother, and he has been lost in grief since Rachel passed. Yesterday, for the first time in months, I saw him smile. Because of Emma. You can't imagine what that means. She brought him back from a darkness I couldn't reach. Margaret's expression wavered, her defenses cracking for just a second before she straightened again. Emma is a child. She doesn't need to be pulled into your pain or your world. She has stability here. She has me. She has a right to her family, Richard said firmly, though his eyes pleaded with hers. To know where she comes from. To have the love of a father who will never abandon her. Rachel may have had her reasons, but I refuse to believe she wanted her daughter to grow up thinking she was alone. You've done an incredible job raising her, I can see that already, but I am her father, and I can't ignore that. I won't. Margaret turned away, her hands trembling as she touched the photo on the mantel. For a long moment she said nothing, her shoulders shaking slightly. Then she whispered, almost to herself, Rachel told me you were kind once. That you loved her deeply. But she was afraid you'd be consumed by your company, by your responsibilities. She didn't want Emma to be another burden for you. Richard's throat tightened, and he stepped closer, his voice breaking. She was never a burden. Neither of them were. I may have failed to see through her walls, but I never stopped loving her. And I will never stop loving the children she gave me. Please, let me be part of Emma's life. For her sake. For Liam's. Margaret turned back to him, her eyes full of conflict. She looked at him as if weighing the sincerity in every line of his face. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally, she sighed and sank into an armchair, looking suddenly older, more fragile. "I don't know what the right thing is," she admitted softly. "But Emma has been asking questions lately. About her father. About her mother. Maybe it's time she heard the truth. I just don't want her heart broken." Richard knelt down in front of her, his voice steady and full of conviction. "Then let me prove I won't break it." For the first time, Margaret didn't look at him with suspicion but with something closer to weary hope. The silence stretched between them, fragile but alive, as though a bridge had been laid across years of secrecy and loss. Richard knew this was only the beginning of a long fight for trust and belonging, but in that moment, he also knew he had taken the first step toward claiming the family he didn't even know he had. The next afternoon, Richard returned to the small house with his chest tightening as though he were about to walk into a meeting that would determine the rest of his life. Margaret had agreed, reluctantly, that he could speak with Emma, but she had made it clear that she would not allow him to sweep the girl away or confuse her with promises he could not keep. He respected that, but his heart trembled at the thought of what lay ahead. For years he had longed for another chance to hold on to something of his wife, and now that chance had appeared in the form of a little girl who had no idea she was his blood. When he knocked this time, the door was opened not by Margaret but by Emma herself. She stood small and hesitant, her curls framing her face, the white rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. Her blue eyes, wide and filled with curiosity, studied him as though she had seen him before but could not place from where. Richard felt his heart lurch. Those eyes were the same as Rachel's, and for a moment he almost forgot to breathe. He crouched down so that he was at her level, his voice soft and careful, as though he were approaching a fragile bird. "Hello, Emma. Do you remember me from the other day?" Emma nodded slowly, her fingers stroking the rabbit's ear nervously. "You're the man with the boy. The one who smiled at me." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Yes. That boy is Liam. He's my son. And he liked meeting you very much." She tilted her head, studying him with a seriousness that seemed too old for her years. "Why are you here?" Before he could answer, Margaret's voice floated from inside. "Emma, let Mr. Hale in." She appeared in the hallway, her eyes sharp but calmer than the day before. Richard stepped into the living room again, but this time he barely noticed its clutter or the lavender scent. His gaze was fixed on Emma, who had perched herself on the couch with her rabbit, waiting as though she sensed something important was about to be said. Richard sat across from her, leaning forward, his hands clasped together to keep them from shaking. He wanted to speak carefully, not to overwhelm her, but the truth pressed so heavily against his chest that it was difficult to hold back. "Emma," he began, his voice low but steady, "I came here because there is something I think you should know. Something about me, and about you." Her brows knitted together, and she hugged the rabbit tighter. "What is it?" He glanced at Margaret, who gave him the faintest nod, though her face was unreadable. He turned back to Emma. "Do you remember your mother? Do you remember how much she loved you?" Emma's lips quivered slightly, and she nodded. "She used to sing to me. And she gave me Bunny. She said I should never lose him." Richard smiled faintly, though his eyes burned with unshed tears. "Yes. She gave you that because it was special to her. She also gave something to me. A son. Liam. Your mother was my wife, Emma. That means I'm your father." The words hung in the air, heavy and almost too sharp for such a tender space. Emma's eyes widened, her mouth parting slightly as though she couldn't take in what she had just heard. She looked to her grandmother, who stood silently, her expression softened but solemn. Then Emma turned back to Richard, her face pale with confusion. "You? My father?" Richard's chest ached, and he nodded, his voice rough. "Yes. I didn't know before. I didn't know you existed, because your mother never told me. But if I had known, I would have been here. I would never have left you alone." Emma's small fingers twisted around the rabbit, and she whispered so softly he almost missed it. "But why didn't she tell you? Why didn't she tell me?" Richard leaned closer, his heart breaking at the pain in her voice. "Sometimes adults make choices they think are protecting the ones they love. I don't know all the reasons, but I know this: your mother loved you more than anything in this world. And she loved Liam, too. She wanted both of you to be safe, even if it meant keeping secrets. But those secrets are not your fault. And they don't change what you are to me. You are my daughter." For a long time Emma just stared at him, her eyes glossy with tears that threatened to fall. Finally she whispered, "I always wondered why I didn't have a father like the other kids at school. I used to ask Grandma, but she just said he wasn't here. I thought maybe he didn't want me." The words sliced through Richard, and his hands shook as he reached out, though he stopped short of touching her, afraid to scare her away. "No, Emma. I want you. More than anything, I want to be here for you. If you let me, I'll never let you feel unwanted again." One tear slid down Emma's cheek, and she looked at him as though searching for proof in his face. Slowly, almost cautiously, she stretched out the hand that wasn't holding the rabbit and placed it into his. Her small fingers trembled against his palm, but the gesture was enough to send a wave of emotion crashing through Richard. He closed his hand gently around hers, not gripping too tightly, just enough to let her know he was there. Margaret's breath caught audibly from where she stood, but she said nothing, her eyes glistening as she watched the fragile bridge being built. Richard leaned in, his voice breaking but full of resolve. "I promise you, Emma. I will never walk away from you again." Emma bit her lip, then whispered, almost like a plea, "Can I see him again? The boy. Liam." Richard's chest swelled with both relief and sorrow, and he nodded. "Yes. You can see him as often as you want. Because he's not just a boy. He's your brother." At that, Emma's tears finally spilled, but they were mixed with a faint smile that trembled at the corners of her lips. Richard held her hand as though it were the most precious thing he had ever been given. In that moment, the truth no longer felt like a burden but a gift, one that could change the shape of all their lives if only they had the courage to embrace it. The following weekend came faster than Richard had anticipated, though for Emma and Liam it felt like an eternity. Margaret had finally agreed to let Emma spend the day with Richard and Liam under her watchful presence, though she made it clear that she would be observing closely. Richard respected her hesitation, knowing trust was not something to be earned overnight. Yet he also knew this day could mark the beginning of something extraordinary, a healing of wounds none of them had asked for but all of them had carried. The meeting was arranged in Richard's home, a vast space of polished floors and towering windows that had always felt too empty since Rachel's death. On that day, however, the house buzzed with a nervous energy. Liam sat in the living room, his small hands tugging at the hem of his shirt, his wide blue eyes filled with questions he hadn't found the courage to ask. Richard knelt down beside him, smoothing back his son's dark hair, and whispered, "She's your sister, Liam. She's been missing from us, but now she's here. Be gentle with her. She's just as nervous as you are." Liam nodded, though his lips pressed together, as if unsure how to feel. He had long carried the weight of being the only child left to Richard after his mother's death, and with it the unspoken loneliness of not fully understanding the depth of that loss. Richard kissed the top of his son's head just as the doorbell rang. His heart skipped a beat. He rose quickly and walked to the door, and when he opened it, Emma stood there holding Margaret's hand, her white rabbit tucked firmly under her arm. Her curls glistened in the soft sunlight, and her eyes darted nervously into the house as though it were another world she wasn't sure she belonged to. "Hello, Emma," Richard said warmly, crouching to her level again. "I'm so glad you came." Emma shifted her weight, clutching the rabbit tighter, but managed a small smile. "Can I see him?" she asked quietly. Richard's throat tightened, and he nodded. "Yes. He's waiting for you." He stepped aside, and Emma stepped cautiously into the living room. Liam stood frozen for a moment, staring at her, and Emma stared back, her breath catching in her chest. It was as if both children were looking at a reflection they didn't expect, similar eyes, similar features, but entirely different lives shaping them. For several long seconds, neither spoke. The silence was so fragile it could have shattered at the smallest sound. Finally, Liam whispered, almost afraid of being wrong, "You're my sister." Emma's voice wavered as she nodded. "That's what he said." "Are you?" Liam blinked rapidly, his cheeks reddening as if he wasn't sure whether to smile or cry. "I always wanted a sister," he admitted, his words tumbling out with the innocence of a child who had spent too long feeling alone. "But I didn't think I'd ever have one." At that, Emma's lips quivered, and she took a tiny step closer. "I didn't think I'd ever have a dad," she whispered back. "Or a brother." The words seemed to break something open in both of them. Liam's eyes filled with tears as he suddenly rushed forward and wrapped his arms around Emma. At first, she stiffened, unused to such open affection, but then her body melted into the embrace, and she clung to him with the same desperation. Richard watched with tears in his eyes, his heart swelling as though it might burst. Margaret, standing behind Emma, covered her mouth with her hand, her stern eyes softening into something that looked very much like hope. The two children clung to each other, and when they finally pulled back, Liam laughed nervously, wiping at his eyes. "Do you want to see my room? I have trains and blocks and a globe that lights up." Emma's eyes lit up faintly, the shadows of her grief lifting just enough to let in a flicker of joy. "I'd like that," she said, her small voice almost smiling. Richard exhaled slowly, a deep and relieved breath that felt like the loosening of chains he hadn't realized were wound so tightly around him. Margaret gave him a look, part warning, part acknowledgement, but she didn't interfere. She allowed the children to slip down the hall together, their laughter tentative at first, then growing stronger as they discovered each other in ways only siblings could. Later that evening, when Margaret insisted it was time to go home, Emma begged to stay a little longer. She had never begged for anything in front of Richard before, and the sound of it nearly unraveled him. Margaret finally relented with an exasperated sigh, and Emma spent the night in Liam's room, both of them curled up under a blanket fort they had built together, whispering secrets as though they had known each other for years instead of hours. Richard stood in the doorway, watching them drift to sleep, his chest full to the brim with love and grief and something new he had not felt in a long time, peace. He knew challenges would come. Margaret's doubts, Emma's fears, and the ghosts of Rachel's choices would haunt them for a while yet. But seeing his children together, side by side, reminded him that families were not defined by perfection but by the courage to hold on to one another despite the brokenness. As the night settled over the house, Richard whispered into the quiet, not to the children but to the memory of his wife. "Rachel, they've found each other. And I swear I'll keep them safe. Both of them." For the first time in years, he believed the future might hold more than sorrow. It might hold healing, laughter, and the kind of love that could survive even the deepest secrets. And as Emma stirred in her sleep, curling closer to her brother, Richard knew that their family, though forged through pain, had finally begun to heal.